The affair of the nun's candle began, as so many absurd tragedies do, with an excess of piety and a shortage of common sense. The small cathedral town of Liskeard, in that charmingly damp corner of Cornwall where even the sea seems to mutter apologies, was in an agreeable flutter over the reopening of St. Agatha's convent, an establishment long closed after the unfortunate business of 1892, when a certain Sister Mildred had mistaken arsenic for altar polish. The reopening had been the talk of every tea-table, though most inhabitants spoke of the place with that mixture of curiosity and superstitious unease reserved for houses where unfortunate accidents had once occurred. It was said, though not loudly, that the nuns of old St. Agatha's had been too fond of their votive candles, and that one of them had continued to burn long after her own burial. Lord Peter Wimsey arrived in Liskeard, not to exorcise legends, but to deliver a lecture on the Restoration poets to the local literary society, a group consisting chiefly of the Archdeacon's wife, 2 retired governesses, and an enthusiastic bookseller who sold more hymnals than verse. Wimsey, finding the atmosphere pleasantly soporific, had already remarked to his valet Bunter that he intended to spend a week doing absolutely nothing except drink poor sherry and annoy the clergy. It was therefore singularly inconvenient of Miss Eleanor Copley, known to the town as the nun who wasn't, to be found dead at matins, seated in the front pew of St. Agatha's chapel, with a candle burning serenely beside her, though every other flame in the church had long since guttered out. It was Mrs. Trevis, the housekeeper, who first raised the alarm. She had gone to open the chapel at 6 o'clock sharp, as instructed by Miss Copley herself the previous evening, and had found the great oak doors slightly ajar. Inside, the cold air was thick with the peculiar sweetness of half-burnt wax. The rest of the candles had drowned themselves in their own tears of tallow, but one candle, set before the statue of the Virgin, still shone clear and unwavering, casting its thin light upon the motionless figure in the pew. Miss Copley's face was peaceful, though curiously pale, and her gloved hands were folded over a small book of hours. Her hat lay neatly beside her. Only the faint bluish mark about her throat suggested that her devotion had been cruelly interrupted. By breakfast time, the Archdeacon had summoned the local constable. The vicar's wife had fainted in the vestry, and the coroner had been telephoned from Bodmin. By luncheon, all of Liskeard knew that Miss Copley was not only dead but, according to rumour, strangled by a ghost. When Lord Peter heard the tale over a particularly indifferent cutlet at the Black Swan Inn, his eyebrows performed a graceful dance of irony. "A ghost, Bunter?" he murmured. "How charmingly domestic of the spectre to tidy up after itself. I dare say it left the pew in better order than most living parishioners." "Yes, my lord," said Bunter, whose tone suggested that ghosts, in his experience, tended to leave a great deal of dust. "The papers say she was alone in the church, my lord. Locked from the inside." "Oh, I do hope they've kept the locks," Wimsey sighed. "There's nothing so stimulating as a murder, which is also a matter of carpentry." That afternoon, in the unhurried drizzle of Cornish autumn, Wimsey walked up the lane to St. Agatha's. The convent's grey stone walls rose modestly against the sky, its spire pointing heavenward as if protesting the gossip below. Inside, a few workmen were still repairing the cloisters, men who looked nervously over their shoulders as Wimsey passed, as though expecting Sister Mildred herself to appear with a can of poison polish. Inspector Willerton of the Liskeard Constabulary, a square man of damp aspect and excessive caution, was already on the scene, notebook in hand. "Nasty business, Lord Peter," he said. "No signs of a struggle. Door bolted from within, only one key found in her own handbag, windows locked tight. I'll be dashed if I can see how anyone got in or out." "The difficulty," said Wimsey, "is that people seldom require doors when they've imagination. Tell me, did anyone observe the church between Compline and Mettons?" "Only old Mrs. Trevis, my lord, who says she saw a light burning through the chapel window around midnight. Says it was blue, but then, she says her husband's ghost whistles through the pantry pipes, so I'm not taking that too serious." Whimsy smiled. "You may be wiser than you know, Inspector. Still, blue light, white light, or divine illumination, it's all worth noting." He stooped to examine the pew where Miss Copley had been found, noting the faint impressions on the wood, the drips of wax hardened like tears, and a curious smudge upon the marble floor, a semicircle of soot just below the candle. "Curious thing, that mark," muttered Willerton. "Could be nothing." "Nothing," said Whimsy lightly, "is frequently the most fascinating thing in the world." He glanced up at the statue before which the candle had burned. The Virgin's stone face regarded him with eternal composure, though the eyes seemed darker than one might expect in daylight. "You see, Bunter," he said quietly, "our Miss Copley may have died alone, but her candle didn't burn for her, it burned instead of her. And that, if I mistake not, is a very tidy little clue indeed." By nightfall, word had spread that Lord Peter Whimsy, the celebrated amateur sleuth, was taking an interest in the affair. The Archdeacon's wife felt half terrified, half flattered, and the townsfolk already whispered that justice, if not salvation, was at hand. But Whimsy, alone in his room at the Black Swan, poured himself a modest glass of port and remarked to Bunter, "There is nothing, my dear fellow, quite so sinister as excessive virtue. A nun's candle, burning when it shouldn't. It smacks of devotion, but smells suspiciously of deceit. Remind me in the morning to inquire who supplied the wax." Bunter inclined his head. "Yes, my lord." And as the rain whispered against the window panes, somewhere in the distance, the bell of St. Agatha's tolled once, low and uncertain, as though uncertain whether to mourn or to warn. The next morning dawned grey and full of wet promises, the kind of English day that makes one feel faintly responsible for the weather's melancholy. Lord Peter Whimsy, never one to let a drizzle dampen his curiosity, arrived at St. Agatha's convent with his hat tilted rakishly and a small notebook in his gloved hand, looking for all the world like a man about to catalogue a rare species of insect. Inspector Willerton awaited him in the vestry, puffing irritably into a handkerchief. The smell of polish and faint incense lingered, as though the building itself had been caught between worship and investigation. Bunter stood discreetly in the corner, silent and efficient, while a cluster of nervous women hovered near the door. Servants, caretakers, and one or two of the newly reinstated sisters. Whimsy, ever courteous, bowed slightly. "I am told," he said, "that Miss Eleanor Copley was a woman of considerable discipline. I should like, if I may, to trouble those who knew her best. Death, like poetry, often improves by commentary." The Archdeacon's housekeeper, Mrs. Trevis, was ushered forward first, her hands trembling in her apron. She was a tall, spare woman with the anxious face of someone accustomed to misplacing things of moral significance. "I found her, sir," she whispered, "just after 6. The door was open a crack, which wasn't right. Miss Copley always locked up proper. I thought perhaps she'd overslept, but when I saw the candle—" She trailed off and crossed herself. Whimsy smiled faintly. "A candle that disobeys bedtime. Remarkable. You saw no one leave the chapel? No sounds in the night?" She shook her head vigorously. "Only the wind, sir. It's dreadful how it moans through those cloisters. Makes you think of souls, if you're that way minded." Whimsy jotted something down. "And the key, Mrs. Trevis? You're quite sure it was hers?" "In her handbag, sir, right beside her prayer book." "Ah," he said lightly, "so the good lady took her security with her. One never knows when divine intervention might require a padlock." The next to be summoned was Sister Agatha, a young novice whose face was too pretty for a veil and too honest for deceit. She had been staying at the convent for barely a fortnight, assisting with the restoration. Her hands twisted nervously around a string of rosary beads as she spoke. "Miss Copley was not one of us, my lord, but she came often. She said she liked to pray at the Virgin's feet after dark. I didn't think it wrong, but Reverend Mother asked her to keep to visiting hours." Whimsy looked up sharply. And did she? The girl hesitated. Mostly, but last night she was restless. I saw her from the dormitory window walking in the garden. She carried her handbag and a small bundle of candles. Not unusual, surely, for a woman fond of devotion, he said mildly. No, my lord, she whispered, but she was crying, and she wore a black cloak I hadn't seen before. Whimsy raised an eyebrow. A cloak, eh? Bunter, we must add mourning apparel to our list of suspicious objects. Inspector Willerton snorted. Likely nothing, my lord. Women often take on fancies when death's about. Whimsy ignored him. Tell me, sister, did she speak to anyone yesterday? Yes, Mr. Guard, the man who tends the gardens. She gave him a packet, said it was for safekeeping. I don't know what was in it. Whimsy's tone softened. Did you mention this to the inspector? The girl blushed. He said it was probably sewing. Whimsy's eyes glinted. Let us never underestimate the criminal potential of a needle, my dear. Thank you. Outside, they found Mr. Guard near the fountain, trimming hedges that did not need trimming. He was a stout, florid man whose expression suggested an uneasy conscience or an ill-fitting collar. When Whimsy approached, he tugged his cap and muttered something about a poor lady gone before her time. Indeed, said Whimsy cheerfully. And you, Mr. Guard, are the last man known to have spoken to her while she was alive. That's a singular privilege. May I ask what was in the packet she entrusted to you? The man shifted. Just papers, sir. She said they were old letters, nothing worth stealing. Old letters often prove fatal, Whimsy observed. You still have them? Guard looked uneasy. No, sir. She came back later after Compline. Said she'd changed her mind and took them away. Whimsy frowned slightly. After Compline? That would be near 10 o'clock. You're certain? Certain as I stand here, sir. She thanked me. Said she'd been foolish to trust anyone. Then she went toward the chapel. I thought no more of it. Whimsy stared at him for a long moment, the drizzle ticking softly against his hat brim. Did you notice whether she was carrying anything besides her bag? Only the candles, sir. One of them long white ones. Looked near to dripping. By the time they returned inside, the air had thickened with unease. Whimsy paused near the pew where Miss Copley's body had been found, and bent to examine the marble floor once more. The semicircle of soot was still there, faint but deliberate. He touched it with his gloved fingertip and brought it to his nose. Paraffin, he murmured. Not beeswax? Curious. I thought nuns preferred the natural article. Willerton frowned. What's that supposed to mean? Only that Miss Copley's candle was not bought with piety in mind. It was made for utility, and one doesn't light utility candles in a place devoted to miracles unless one intends a very earthly result. He stood and looked toward the door. Tell me, Inspector, who has charge of the keys when the chapel is closed? Mrs. Trevis keeps one, Miss Copley had another, and the Reverend Mother holds the third. Why? Because, said Whimsy, if a room is locked from within, we must first discover who had no need to use the door. That afternoon, Whimsy was invited to tea with the Reverend Mother in her small parlor overlooking the garden. She was a pale, composed woman whose serenity seemed carved rather than grown. Miss Copley was devoted, she said in her cool voice, a little too devoted, perhaps. She came to us after her brother died, an old scandal in London, something to do with business fraud. She sought peace here. Whimsy listened, noting the faint tightening at the corners of her mouth. And did she find it? She tried to, said the Reverend Mother. But she was proud. She quarreled with me over the restoration funds. I feared she meant to withdraw her donation. Ah, said Whimsy softly. And that would have been inconvenient. The nun's eyes flicked toward him, calm but sharp. The convent has many needs, Lord Peter. The dead are no use to us. On the contrary, he said lightly, They often leave tidy legacies. When he left her room, the rain had ceased and the air smelled faintly of wax and damp stone. Bunter, who had been taking quiet photographs of the pews, joined him in the cloister. "You've the look of a man who's seen the beginning of something unpleasant, my lord." Wimsey smiled faintly. "Merely the middle, Bunter. The beginning happened long ago, when Miss Copley decided she could atone with candles. There's an unholy neatness about the business. Keys, wax, time, silence. Someone arranged it like a hymn, and every verse ends in deceit." Bunter nodded. "Shall I make further inquiries about the candles, my lord?" "Do, and see if you can learn where she purchased them. Ordinary paraffin in a town that prides itself on piety, that's enough to make even a saint suspicious." Wimsey paused, glancing back toward the chapel where the Virgin's stone gaze seemed to follow him through the glass. "You see, Bunter," he murmured, "people think sin announces itself with thunder and lightning, but it seldom does. It creeps in with the smell of clean wax and the sound of a key turning quietly in a lock." That night, as they dined at the Black Swan, Inspector Willerton arrived with an air of reluctant confession. "We found something, my lord. A second cloak in her wardrobe, torn at the collar with wax stains down the front. But here's the odd thing. The wax is red." Wimsey set down his fork with exaggerated care. "Red, Inspector? How unfashionable. Of death to be theatrical." He rose, the gleam of amusement returning to his eyes. "Well, Bunter, it seems our nun burned 2 candles that night, one for God and one for deceit. Let us discover which burned longer." The following morning brought with it a brittle sort of sunshine, the kind that makes English stone look freshly scrubbed, but never warm. Lord Peter Wimsey stood before the chapel doors again, his hands deep in his coat pockets, whistling a tune from Purcell with lazy precision. Behind him, Inspector Willerton shuffled in the gravel, clearly irritated by Wimsey's apparent lack of urgency. "I don't see," the inspector said at last, "how a bit of candle wax, red or otherwise, helps us. The lady's dead, the door was locked, and that's the end of it." Wimsey smiled absently. "My dear Willerton, if death were ever the end of it, the clergy would be out of work. No, no, wax is a very talkative substance. It tells you where it has dripped, whom it has lighted, and sometimes whom it has betrayed." He stepped inside the chapel, where the air was cool and dry now, stripped of incense but still carrying that faint undertone of spent flame. The sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows in pale shards, touching the pews with blood-colored light. Wimsey went straight to the Virgin's altar, stooped again, and this time produced a small magnifying glass from his pocket. "Beeswax leaves a soft bloom, Inspector, white, delicate. Paraffin leaves none. But this is mixed. You see the faint granularity? Someone blended them." "Blended them?" Willerton frowned. "To what end?" "To deceive the pious eye," said Wimsey. "A candle that looks holy but burns like a tradesman's torch. A pretty metaphor, don't you think? Miss Copley may not have been the only one praying here." He moved next to the pew where she had sat, tracing his gloved finger along the wood. "Bunter," he said, "you photographed this yesterday. Do you notice the faint smudge here, just beneath where her sleeve rested?" Bunter bent obediently. "Yes, my lord. A kind of powder. I took a sample." "Excellent fellow," said Wimsey. "See that it's tested for cosmetics. Face powder, perhaps, or talc. I have a notion that Miss Copley's murderer was as fond of appearances as of candles." Willerton snorted. "You've more notions than I've had hot dinners." "That," said Wimsey cheerfully, "is because I dine better." He turned, letting his gaze sweep the small rows of seats, the lectern, the narrow aisle. "Tell me, Inspector, did anyone remark what Miss Copley wore that night?" "Her ordinary visiting clothes," said Willerton. "Dark skirt, gloves, hat, nothing odd about them." "Nothing odd," Wimsey mused. "A woman strangled, yet not a mark on her gloves. a handbag placed tidily beside her, a candle burning at her elbow. It all smacks of ritual. Domestic ritual, if you like. The kind that hides a crime behind a curtain of habit. The door creaked, and Reverend Mother entered, her veil gliding like a shadow over the floor. She inclined her head to Whimsy with cold civility. "You find something new, Lord Peter?" "Only confirmation of what I already suspected," he said lightly, "that the Almighty disapproves of paraffin." The faintest twitch crossed her lips. "If you mean to mock faith, my lord, I shall ask you to do it elsewhere." "Mockery, dear lady, is my defense against despair," he replied, bowing. "Tell me, did you know of any visitor Miss Copley expected that night?" "None," she said swiftly. She was solitary by inclination. Her only correspondents were the Archdeacon and her solicitor in London. "Ah," said Whimsy, "and yet she carried letters. A packet of them entrusted to Mr. Guard for safekeeping. Did she tell you of them?" The Reverend Mother's eyes hardened. "No, she kept her affairs to herself. It is not the habit of this house to pry." "An admirable sentiment," said Whimsy, though not one shared by detectives. After she had gone, Whimsy turned to Willerton. "There's guilt in that woman's poise," he said softly. "But not of murder. She hides something inconvenient, perhaps financial. Still, her secret runs alongside the crime, not through it." He tapped his chin thoughtfully. "We must trace those letters. If Miss Copley took them back from Mr. Guard, she meant to destroy or deliver them before midnight." He looked up sharply. "Who saw the post that morning?" "The curate handles it," said Willerton. "Name's Elcott. Young, serious type." "Then let us be serious with him." They found Reverend Elcott in his small office at the back of the church, surrounded by envelopes and the smell of damp parchment. He was a thin young man with prematurely stooped shoulders, as though apologizing for his own existence. He greeted them with a distracted air. "Terrible business. Terrible," he murmured. "I knew Miss Copley only in passing, you understand. She funded part of our restoration. Generous woman." Whimsy took the chair opposite him. "Indeed. And she posted nothing yesterday morning." The curate hesitated. I couldn't say for certain. There were several envelopes on the vestry table. One was addressed to a London firm, solicitors, I think. But when I returned later, it was gone." "Gone?" "Yes. I assumed she had taken it herself." Whimsy's eyes narrowed. "And you saw her again after Compline?" "Only in the garden, I think. She passed the window about 10 minutes before the bell. She looked, well, purposeful." He flushed. "Forgive me, my lord. I thought it strange at the time, but one doesn't question pious ladies about their evening walks." Whimsy rose. "No, one doesn't. But one might question what else she was posting besides letters." Back at the Black Swan, Whimsy dined quietly, turning his wineglass between his fingers, while Bunter laid the evening paper beside him. The headline screamed, "Mystery of the Nun's Candle Deepens." Whimsy gave a small, ironic laugh. "They do make it sound rather operatic, don't they? As though poor Miss Copley were stabbed between Kyries." Bunter cleared his throat. "The tests, my lord. The powder, definitely cosmetic. A rather expensive French brand." "Ah," said Whimsy, "and I'd wager it isn't Miss Copley's. Piety rarely indulges in Paris." He sipped his wine, then spoke almost to himself. "So we have paraffin instead of beeswax, red wax instead of white, and French powder instead of humility. It's a carnival of substitution. Someone has been playing saint with stage props." He leaned back. "Bunter, fetch the train schedule for Bodmin and Plymouth. I fancy our ghost commuted." The following day, he visited the village chemist, a neat little man with spectacles and a passion for order. "Ah, yes, my lord," the man said eagerly when asked about candles. "Sold a dozen white ones not a fortnight ago, to Miss Copley herself. Beeswax, best quality. But I've also had inquiries from another lady, Mrs. Trevis, the Archdeacon's housekeeper. Wanted paraffin candles, large ones. Said she was afraid of drafts. Drafts, said Whimsy thoughtfully. Did she by chance buy red wax as well? Why, yes, sir, only yesterday morning. Odd sort of woman, said she wanted to test something. Indeed, murmured Whimsy. I dare say she has. By late afternoon, Whimsy was back at the convent, asking for Mrs. Trevis. She received him in the kitchen, hands red from scrubbing. You've been busy, he said mildly. Nothing like work to ease the nerves, eh? She eyed him warily. You're here about those candles, I suppose. I bought them because the wind keeps blowing the others out. Naturally, said Whimsy. Though it's curious you should favor paraffin when the chapel insists on beeswax. Did Miss Copley share your taste? Her jaw tightened. I wouldn't know. Whimsy's tone softened. Come now, Mrs. Trevis. You were fond of her, weren't you? Or perhaps afraid of her? She flinched. Afraid? No, only sorry. She was lonely, poor soul. Always talking to that statue like it could answer back. Said she'd been wronged, and the Virgin knew it. Wronged how? Didn't say. But she kept a small key on a chain round her neck. I saw it once when she bent over the pew, said it was for something that shouldn't ever be opened again. Whimsy studied her face. And after her death, did you see that key? No, sir. The police took her handbag, but the chain wasn't on her. Whimsy's eyes gleamed. Then, my dear lady, the dead kept their secrets only briefly. Someone relieved her of them. When he left the kitchen, the rain had begun again, fine and steady, and the scent of wet earth rose from the garden. Whimsy stood a moment beneath the eaves, listening to the dripping gutters. A missing key, a locked chapel, a candle that burns too long, he murmured. All the makings of a moral fable. He glanced at Bunter. It's time we looked into her brother's scandal, the one in London. People who atone too late often do so because someone reminds them of their guilt. Bunter inclined his head. Shall I make the inquiries, my lord? Do so, and send a telegram to her solicitor. Ask what property Miss Copley held in her name, and whether any was meant for the church. Whimsy smiled faintly, lighting a cigarette. If I'm right, Bunter, this was not a crime of passion, but of redemption. And those, he added, blowing a thin plume of smoke into the rain, are the nastiest kind. The telegram from London arrived the next morning while Whimsy was taking breakfast in the inn's private sitting room. Bunter handed it across with the silent efficiency of a conjurer producing a rabbit. Whimsy slit it open with his butter knife, scanned the contents, and gave a soft, appreciative whistle. Ah, he murmured, so the lady had more conscience than coin. Miss Eleanor Copley, it appears, had recently altered her will. Half her estate to the convent, the other half, the delicious ambiguity of human affection, to an unnamed individual whose identity the solicitor refused to commit to paper. Confidential, he says. Confidentiality is always the first refuge of guilt. He stirred his tea thoughtfully. Bunter, I fancy our mystery is less theological than financial. Bunter, who was pouring milk, did not look up. Indeed, my lord. Shall I assume that the alteration of the will may have inspired both the piety and the paraffin? You may, said Whimsy cheerfully, and we must now discover who stood to gain or lose by that act of generosity. He arrived at the convent mid-morning, where Inspector Willerton was already conferring with the Reverend Mother near the cloisters. The nun's calm face betrayed nothing, but her voice carried the edge of weary patience. I assure you, Inspector, the convent has received no money, nor do we seek it. Miss Copley's benefactions were voluntary and of the soul. The soul, muttered Willerton, doesn't pay for roof repairs. Whimsy stepped forward, bowing slightly. Good morning, Reverend Mother. A curious morning for piety, don't you think? So much damp holiness about. I should like a few words with you about Miss Copley's will. She stiffened. I know nothing of it. No, said Whimsy lightly. but I rather think you suspected something. It isn't every day a lady of limited means promises half her estate to the church. Was there any hint she might have changed her mind?" The nun hesitated for the briefest instant, a breath caught between protest and truth. She spoke of her brother's disgrace," she said at last. "She believed she could cleanse the family name by doing good, but she was troubled. She said the world was not done with her yet." Whimsy's eyes brightened. "Ah, not done with her. How very prophetic." He wandered out to the garden after that, humming absently, where Mr. Guard was again at his post among the hedges. "A man could go mad," said the gardener, "with all you gents asking the same questions." "Repetition," said Whimsy, "is the soul of discovery. You mentioned before that Miss Copley collected her letters the night of her death. Did she say where she was going?" Guard scratched his chin. "No, sir, but she was in a temper, said something about a promise broken. Funny, too, she wasn't wearing her usual gloves. Had them tucked in her pocket." Whimsy paused. "Bare hands, you say? That's unlike her." "Aye, well, she was upset." The air was fair, humming around her. Whimsy's gaze drifted toward the chapel spire. The air, my good man, was humming with lies. He returned inside to the vestry, where Bunter was arranging photographs of the pews and altar. "Observe this," said Whimsy, pointing to one image. "There, just under the seat. See the faint indentation? That, Bunter, is the mark of a small iron object, perhaps a key, resting against the wood. Our lady may have dropped it there in her final moments, or had it placed there by another. Shall I search the area again, my lord?" "With the inspector's blessing, yes. Tell him it's in the interest of theological accuracy." Bunter departed with quiet purpose. Whimsy lingered, gazing at the light slanting through the windows, where dust motes turned the air into slow gold. He felt, rather than heard, the presence behind him. Mrs. Trevis stood in the doorway, wringing a damp cloth. "You won't find peace here, my lord," she said hoarsely. "Some things are best left buried." "So I have been told," said Whimsy, turning. "Yet people insist on burying them in such obvious places. Come now, Mrs. Trevis, what was Miss Copley afraid of?" "Afraid?" Her voice cracked. She wasn't afraid, she was angry. Someone had written to her, threatened to expose something about her brother's business. She said it was blackmail, but she wouldn't go to the police, said she'd handle it herself. "And did she?" "I don't know. She went to the chapel that night, said she'd make an offering and be done with it. Next thing I knew—" Her throat worked soundlessly. Whimsy's gaze softened. "You cared for her, didn't you?" "She was a proud woman," the housekeeper said. "Too proud to beg forgiveness, but she didn't deserve what she got." "Few do," murmured Whimsy. "Tell me, did she post anything unusual before she died?" Mrs. Trevis hesitated. "Yes, a small parcel, wrapped in brown paper, addressed to London, but the name was smudged. I gave it to the curate, myself." Whimsy nodded slowly. "Then perhaps our salvation lies not in the chapel, but in the post." By afternoon, Bunter had returned with his findings. The indentation beneath the pew did indeed match the shape of a small key, but the key itself was missing. He also reported that the chemist's apprentice remembered selling red wax to Mrs. Trevis and, more intriguingly, a tiny bottle of ether. Whimsy raised his brows. "Ether, Bunter. My, what an unholy trinity. Wax, paraffin, and ether. Enough to stage a miracle or a murder." "Possibly both, my lord." "Quite. Fetch me the inspector." Willerton arrived, damp and disgruntled as usual. Whimsy greeted him with that air of polite mischief which always heralded trouble. "Inspector, we have a trinity of facts. First, Miss Copley changed her will. Second, someone threatened her. Third, her candle burned with mixed wax, a chemical curiosity if ever there was one. What say you to a theory?" "I say," grunted Willerton, "you've too many of them." "Patience, my dear fellow. Suppose Miss Copley met her blackmailer in the chapel, intending to pay him or her off. Suppose, too, that the meeting turned unpleasant. There's a struggle, a moment's rage, and she's strangled. The killer, anxious to make it appear devotional, props her body, lights a candle, locks the door, and departs with the key. Elegant, yes? Except for one thing, said Willerton. How'd the killer get out if the door was bolted inside? Whimsy smiled. That, Inspector, is precisely the point. The door was bolted, but perhaps not by the living. He left the remark hanging like incense smoke, and Willerton's puzzled frown was its own reward. That evening, Whimsy sat by the inn's fire, reading through Miss Copley's correspondence, which the coroner had reluctantly lent him. Most of it was harmless chatter from charities and clerical societies, but one letter caught his attention. The handwriting was elegant, the tone intimate. You must not imagine the past can be erased by charity. There are those who remember what your brother did, and who profited. Keep your promise, or I must act. The signature was a single initial, E. Whimsy leaned back, eyes half closed. E for Elcott, perhaps? Or Eleanor? No, she wouldn't threaten herself. E for, Esmond Copley, the dead brother. A ghost, indeed, but one conveniently impersonated. Bunter entered quietly with a telegram reply. From the solicitor, my lord. Says the unnamed heir was a Mr. Henry Guard. Whimsy smiled. Our gardener. How deliciously rustic, and how very foolish of him to leave his initials all over the garden tools. He rose, stretching languidly. Tomorrow, Bunter, we dig a little deeper, literally and figuratively. I fancy Mr. Guard planted more than bulbs. The next day dawned bright and cold. Whimsy, accompanied by Willerton and Bunter, found Guard trimming the rose bushes as if nothing had happened. Whimsy's manner was courteous but edged. Mr. Guard, I believe you were closer to Miss Copley than you've admitted. Her will names you as a beneficiary. A tidy sum, I imagine. The gardener froze. I didn't know that. No? Then you must also not have known she intended to revoke it. She found out you'd written those charming letters, threatening to expose her brother's crimes unless she kept you in her will. When she refused, you came here at night, expecting payment, and found piety instead of profit. Guard's face drained of color. That's lies. Is it? Said Whimsy softly. Then why the ether? A gardener with no ailments, yet you bought a drug that renders a body insensible. You strangled her when she awoke, lit your own candle to cover the scent, and left by the vestry window you'd unlatched earlier. But you forgot one thing, the paraffin soot on the marble, marking where your false holiness dripped. Guard's hands clenched. You can't prove. Oh, but we can, said Whimsy. Bunter found your thumbprint on the candle holder, preserved in wax. Even miracles leave fingerprints. Guard sagged, defeated. She was going to tell them all, he muttered. She said she'd give everything to the church. I only wanted what was mine. Whimsy's eyes were almost kind. My dear man, no fortune is ever worth a bad night's sleep. As the police led the man away, Whimsy turned toward the chapel where the last of the sunlight touched the Virgin's stone face. Strange, he murmured, how the purest faith burns the darkest shadows. Bunter glanced at him. Shall I pack, my lord? Yes, Bunter, he said quietly. We've burnt enough candles in this place to last a lifetime. That evening, as the subdued clatter of supper faded through the corridors of the Black Swan, Whimsy sat alone in the lamplight, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin and his eyes fixed not on the room but somewhere just behind it, as though memory itself were offering testimony. Bunter stood by the window, adjusting the curtains against the thin November wind. The silence between them was not the silence of ease, but that of two men listening for the echo of something half understood. There is, Whimsy said at last, always a moment, in any case, when one begins to suspect that the obvious villain is merely a convenient scapegoat. Guard's confession, if you can dignify that strangled mumble as such, lacked the one quality a confession should possess: conviction. Bunter looked up. "You think he lied, my lord?" "I think," said Wimsey softly, "that he believed what he said, which is worse. A man who convinces himself he is telling the truth is infinitely more dangerous than one who knows he's lying. No, Bunter, I'm not satisfied. There is something too neat about this tidy morality tale of greed and guilt. The locked door still troubles me. Guard's window, trick explains the escape, perhaps, but not the motive's depth. Men kill for money. They seldom choreograph it like a mass." He rose, took his hat, and announced he was going for a walk. Bunter did not argue. The rain had ceased, leaving the town slick and ghostly, the cobbles shining like wet pewter under the lamps. Wimsey walked slowly toward the convent, his footsteps hollow in the damp air. The great spire loomed against a smudged moon, and somewhere within, a bell tolled the late hour. He found the chapel doors unlocked, an oversight, or perhaps an invitation. Inside, the air was dense with silence. He lit one of the altar candles and watched the flame lean toward the draught from the vestry door. There was no sign of struggle now, no trace of the woman who had sat so primly in death, only the faint scent of wax and cold stone. "A curious business," he murmured. "Too clean, too staged. The killer was meticulous, almost reverent." He moved toward the pew where Miss Copley had been found, noticing for the first time a small, almost invisible crack in the floorboard beneath. He knelt, pried it gently with his penknife, and found, wedged in the narrow gap, the corner of a folded paper. It was brittle with age and smelled faintly of old smoke. The ink had bled, but a few words were legible. To be opened only in repentance. Beneath it, a signature: Esmond Copley. "So," said Wimsey quietly, "the dead brother speaks again." He replaced the board with care and stood, lost in thought. Behind him came a soft rustle, like fabric shifting. "You should not be here, Lord Peter." The voice was calm, measured. Reverend Mother stood in the doorway, her face a pale oval in the candlelight. "Curiosity," he said, smiling faintly, "is a form of worship, my dear lady. I was merely paying my respects to the departed." "And disturbing her rest." "Her rest," said Wimsey, "was disturbed long before I arrived. Tell me, how long have you known the truth?" She did not answer at once. The candlelight trembled between them. "You think I am guilty?" "Of murder?" "No. Of silence, perhaps. There's a remarkable economy in your words, Reverend Mother. You speak only when the truth is in danger of escaping." A faint shadow crossed her face. "You would not understand. Miss Copley came to us broken. She wanted forgiveness, but not from God, from her brother." "Impossible," said Wimsey softly. "The man's been dead these 10 years. Not to her," she said. "She believed she had driven him to ruin. She falsified accounts to protect him. He discovered it and took the blame. When he died, she tried to undo the sin with charity. But the world will not have unbalanced books, Lord Peter. The balance must always be restored. And God. God was Esmond's clerk once. He knew the truth and used it to bleed her. I warned her not to meet him, but she would not listen. She said she must make peace. I thought she meant prayer." "But she meant payment," said Wimsey. "Yes." Wimsey paced slowly, the echo of his steps small against the vast hush. "And yet even that doesn't fit. God claims he strangled her in a quarrel, but his hands show no bruises, no abrasions. She was not a frail woman. She'd have struggled. And yet there was no sign of it. No overturned pew, no broken clasp. Only that faint mark on her throat, delicate as the touch of silk." He looked up sharply. "She was already unconscious when she died. The ether, Mrs. Trevis bought it for someone." The Reverend Mother's composure faltered. I told her to give it to me. I meant to dispose of it, but she kept it, said she could not sleep without it. Did she give any to Miss Copley? The nun's silence was answer enough. Whimsy sighed. A mercy killing, then, or something that looked like one. The housekeeper thinking she was easing pain, and the blackmailer taking advantage of the opportunity. But no. Guard's panic was too genuine. He didn't know she'd been drugged already. He turned toward the altar again, eyes narrowing at the row of candlesticks. Unless, he murmured, someone else arranged the scene. He reached for the candlestick nearest the Virgin's statue and tilted it. A small catch released, and the base came away in his hand. Inside was a narrow compartment, empty save for a trace of white residue. Ingenious, he said softly. A candle that conceals a vial, perhaps of ether, perhaps poison. Whoever prepared this meant for her to breathe it as she prayed. The Reverend Mother crossed herself, eyes wide. God forgive us. I did not know. No, said Whimsy, but someone did. Someone who knew the rituals, the timing of the prayers, the exact moment the flame would gutter and the fumes rise. Someone like you, perhaps? She flinched, but he went on, his voice gentle. Not from malice, but pity. You thought she'd suffered enough. You made her death look peaceful, devout, an end befitting repentance. She pressed her hands together, trembling. You cannot prove that. I do not wish to, said Whimsy. I dislike tragedies that pretend to be mercies. But the law, you know, is very bad at distinguishing between the two. She turned away, and for a moment he thought she might collapse. Instead, she straightened, her face composed again. You are wrong, she said quietly. I did not kill her. I prepared the candle, yes, but only to frighten her, to fill the air with the scent of ether, not to harm. She feared that smell. It reminded her of her brother's deathbed. I wanted her to confess before the end. When I found her, it was already too late. Whimsy studied her a long time. And you left her there, serene and penitent. She was smiling, said the nun. I thought, perhaps God had answered. Whimsy bowed his head. He answers in peculiar ways. When he returned to the inn, Bunter was waiting with his usual air of discreet readiness. Did you find peace, my lord? Whimsy smiled without mirth. I found theology. Bunter. A dangerous pursuit. It begins with prayer and ends with homicide. He poured himself a small brandy and stared into it as if it might yield more clues. The Reverend Mother played priest and penitent both, and Guard, poor fool, blundered into her ceremony thinking it a transaction. Miss Copley's candle burned alone because the living had all run out of faith. Bunter inclined his head. Shall I inform the inspector? No, said Whimsy after a pause. Let the church keep its mysteries. The law would make a spectacle of pity, and I'm tired of crucifixions. He rose, gathering his hat. We'll leave tomorrow. I've a lecture to finish on the Restoration poets. More murder there than in any convent. Later, as he lay awake, listening to the faint tolling of St. Agatha's bell, Whimsy thought of the letter under the floorboard and the pale smile on Miss Copley's face. The flame of the candle had been narrow and pure, untouched by wind, as though the air itself had bowed in reverence. He could almost hear her whispering in the silence, not in fear, but relief. To be opened only in repentance. Perhaps, he thought, that was all she had wanted. To open the past and let it breathe. Outside, the wind sighed through the town like the closing of a door, and Whimsy, staring into the dark, murmured one of his favorite lines from Dawn. "'Tis certain we must die, but none can say we shall be dead." Then he smiled faintly and closed his eyes, letting the rain begin again. Morning crept into Liskeard like a cautious apology, the clouds dragging themselves over the rooftops with the weary resignation of parishioners after a long sermon. Lord Peter Whimsy, having declared himself neither saint nor sinner, but a man in need of a decent breakfast, descended to the dining room at the Black Swan to find Inspector Willerton already stationed there, radiating bureaucratic discomfort. The inspector had the expression of a man who wished to arrest someone, preferably anyone, if only to bring the case to an end. "Well, my lord," he began, buttering his toast with grim determination. "Guard's been transferred to Bodmin jail. He's sticking to his story, says he only meant to frighten her. The coroner's satisfied, and the archdeacon wants the chapel purified. I'd say that's the end of it." Whimsy poured himself coffee, watching the thin curl of steam rise like a ghost with unfinished business. "The end, my dear Willerton, is an overrated concept. Nature abhors a conclusion almost as much as it abhors a vacuum. Have you never noticed that even the most pious crimes resist tidy closure?" Willerton grunted. "I notice criminals don't resist prison." "True," said Whimsy mildly, "but sometimes they go there accompanied by the wrong conscience." He finished his coffee, flicked an invisible crumb from his cuff, and added, "I think I shall visit the chapel once more. There's something unsatisfied about that place, as though it's waiting to confess again." Willerton sighed. "You'll find nothing, my lord. We've combed it twice." "Indeed," said Whimsy, "and in my experience, nothing is precisely where the truth likes to hide." He set off through the mist-damp streets, Bunter following a respectful pace behind, the picture of discretion in human form. The air around St. Agatha's was cold enough to bite, but Whimsy seemed invigorated by it, striding with the peculiar grace of a man who could find entertainment in morbidity. Inside, the chapel was silent except for the faint ticking of the great clock on the tower, an old relic restored only recently and apparently proud of its regularity. Whimsy looked up at it thoughtfully. "Curious thing, Bunter. Do you recall the coroner's estimate of death? Between 10 and midnight, I believe, yet the bell was said to toll once, faintly, near dawn. No one wound the clock between those hours, and yet the mechanism struck true, almost as if the dead wished to mark the hour themselves." Bunter, accustomed to such musings, said nothing. Whimsy began to pace the aisle, his gaze moving from floor to rafters, until he stopped abruptly before the confessional booth. "Now, here is the thing," he murmured. The confessional door was ajar, and a faint smell of something sharp lingered inside, not incense, not polish, but chemical. He opened it and crouched. On the worn wooden shelf lay a small scrap of lace, yellowed and stiff, along with a folded note stained by wax. He opened it delicately. "Forgive me, I have sinned against both faith and flesh." There was no signature, only a date, 2 days before Miss Copley's death. "Well," said Whimsy softly, "that explains her restless prayers. But whose handwriting is this?" He compared it with a letter from her effects and frowned. "Not hers. The strokes are firmer, masculine, controlled. Someone else confessed, or pretended to. But why leave the note here?" Bunter bent beside him. "Perhaps the blackmailer left it, my lord, to remind her of guilt." "Perhaps," said Whimsy. "Or perhaps it was written by the one person who could absolve her, her brother's ghost given ink and paper by a living hand." He slipped the note into his pocket and stood. At that moment, a door creaked open behind them. It was Sister Agatha, pale and trembling, clutching her rosary as though it were a shield. "Lord Peter," she whispered, "you mustn't be here. The Reverend Mother forbade anyone to enter until the blessing ceremony." "Ah, my dear sister," said Whimsy with disarming warmth. "I've never been much good at obeying forbiddances. They spoil all the fun." She looked about nervously. "If she finds you, then she will scold me in Latin, which I shall enjoy immensely. Tell me, sister, did you ever see anyone use this confessional besides Miss Copley?" "Only once," she said after a pause. "The Reverend Mother herself, the night before it happened. I came to tell her the bell was slow, but she was inside. I thought she was praying. Whimsy's brows lifted. Ah, so the Reverend Mother's devotion extends to the mechanical. You say the bell was slow? Yes, my lord. It struck 1 when my watch said 12:30. Whimsy's expression sharpened. 12:30, you say? That means the chapel clock was a full 30 minutes behind. Yes, my lord, we meant to have it repaired. Indeed, he murmured. And yet the coroner based his estimate of time upon that very clock, which means Miss Copley may have died not before midnight, but well after. And that, my dear sister, changes everything. He thanked her, left her trembling in confusion, and strode outside, where the clouds were beginning to lift. Bunter, he said, fetch the inspector. I require him to witness a miracle of arithmetic. Within the hour, Willerton arrived, damp and exasperated. What now, my lord? Haven't we wrung every drop of mystery out of this case? On the contrary, said Whimsy, we've only squeezed the rind. Observe, if the chapel clock was half an hour slow, then Miss Copley's death occurred nearer to 12:30 than midnight. The Reverend Mother claims she found her at dawn, but what if she found her much earlier, say around 1, and delayed the discovery until morning? It would give her time to arrange the scene, light the candle, and bolt the door. You mean she faked the whole thing? Not the death itself, perhaps, but the tableau, a confession turned tragedy, repainted as piety. She feared scandal, not justice. Her order depends on appearance. Willerton scratched his head. But you've no proof. Whimsy smiled faintly. I've something better. Motive, opportunity, and a conscience too holy to lie directly, but quite willing to mislead by omission. They confronted the Reverend Mother in her study, the room stripped bare of ornament except for a crucifix and a faint smell of lavender polish. She met Whimsy's gaze without flinching. You have come to torment me again, Lord Peter. Merely to tidy the edges, dear lady. You see, the clock betrayed you. You said you came upon the body at dawn, but the bell told otherwise. The candle was burned half down. Not enough for 5 hours, only 2. You delayed the alarm because you wished the world to believe she died at peace, not mid-confession. You bolted the door, lit the candle anew, and went to your rest. A noble deceit, perhaps, but deceit all the same. Her lips trembled. She was already gone, she whispered. I found her kneeling, her face turned upward as though she'd seen forgiveness. I thought if the world knew she died thus, there would be gossip, scandal. I only wanted her memory clean. Whimsy's tone softened. Cleanliness, dear mother, is a dangerous obsession. Too much of it scrubs the truth away. You will tell the police? She asked. No, said Whimsy after a pause. You've punished yourself more thoroughly than the law ever could, but you will write a statement for the coroner, adjusting the time. The rest we shall leave to divine editing. When they left the convent, the sun had broken through at last, casting the wet stones in glistening patterns. Willerton shook his head. So that's it then. No murder, just pity and deceit. Pity and deceit, echoed Whimsy, are the Siamese twins of virtue, Inspector. You can hardly tell them apart. He paused, gazing back at the chapel. Still, I fancy Miss Copley would not have minded. She sought forgiveness, and she found it, though not quite from heaven. And the Reverend Mother? She will live long enough to understand that forgiveness isn't hers to grant. Whimsy smiled faintly, then turned away. Come, Bunter, we have a train to catch. I'm suddenly seized by the desire for something scandalously secular. Perhaps champagne. That evening, as the train pulled away from the Cornish hills, Whimsy leaned against the window, watching the last of the light fade over the countryside. Curious thing, Bunter, he said. The case began with a candle that refused to die and ends with a truth that refused to stay buried. It's all frightfully moral. Bunter, arranging his master's case, replied gravely, Morality, my lord, is seldom convenient. Whimsy laughed softly. No, indeed. but it does make splendid copy for the Archdeacon's wife." He stretched, closed his eyes, and added, "Remind me never again to involve myself in ecclesiastical crimes, Bunter. They leave one with an unwholesome respect for hell." The train whistled, the countryside slipped away, and somewhere far behind them, in the little chapel of St. Agatha, the candle that had started it all guttered out at last, leaving behind only a faint thread of smoke curling upward, like the ghost of a prayer no longer needed. The following week found Lord Peter Wimsey once again in London, restored to the comfortable chaos of his Piccadilly flat, where Bach competed amiably with the rumble of the city outside, and Bunter presided with sacerdotal precision over the domestic rituals. The newspapers, having had their brief ecstasy over the nun's candle mystery, had already moved on to fresher scandals: politicians, prize-fighters, and a bishop accused of atheism. Wimsey, sprawled in his armchair in a dressing-gown of improbable hue, read the morning edition with mild amusement, his long legs crossed and a cigarette burning languidly between his fingers. "You see, Bunter," he remarked, "the world has a splendidly short attention span. In Cornwall they were lighting candles to commemorate the dead, and in Fleet Street they're already lighting cigars over their replacements. One might almost believe murder was a passing inconvenience." Bunter, polishing the silver tea service, did not look up. "The living must carry on, my lord." "Indeed," said Wimsey, "and so must we. But tell me, have we received the Reverend Mother's statement?" "Yes, my lord, delivered by post this morning." Bunter produced a sealed envelope from the table. Wimsey opened it delicately, scanning the neat, disciplined handwriting. "Ah," he murmured, "confession by correspondence, the English soul at its most efficient." The letter was brief, almost severe. "I have amended my account for the coroner's record. Miss Copley's time of death has been corrected, her peace restored. I pray that your conscience is as quiet as ours now must be." Wimsey smiled faintly. "Quiet conscience? My dear woman, you clearly underestimate mine. It chatters like a nesting rook." He folded the letter and set it aside. "Still, she's tidy to the end. Bunter, fetch the Bodmin paper, will you? I'm curious whether poor Guard's found religion yet." When Bunter returned with the folded sheet, Wimsey read aloud the short column. "Henry Guard, formerly gardener at St. Agatha's convent, was released without charge, insufficient evidence having been found to sustain the accusation. He has since left Cornwall for parts unknown." "Parts unknown," Wimsey repeated. "How satisfyingly vague. The English justice system excels at vagueness. It's our only real poetry." He stood, stretched, and went to the window, where the light of a weak sun glinted on the wet pavements below. "So there we have it, Bunter. One dead woman, one exonerated fool, one penitent nun, and one detective in need of intellectual consolation. I believe I shall read some dawn." The days that followed were curiously restless ones. London, with its comfortable vulgarity, should have swept away the mists of Cornwall, yet Wimsey found the image of that single candle still smouldering in the recesses of his mind. He dined with friends, attended a recital, even played bridge at his club, but each diversion seemed touched by a faint unreality, as though the world had tilted imperceptibly out of joint. "The trouble with solving mysteries," he confided one evening to Charles Parker, "is that one begins to suspect life of deliberate ambiguity. One uncovers motives, but never meanings." Parker, who had the sturdy soul of a policeman, replied, "You're getting metaphysical again. Stick to murder, it's simpler." "Ah," said Wimsey, "if only it were. But murder, my dear Charles, is simply metaphysics enacted in flesh." Parker rolled his eyes and ordered another pint. Later that night, alone again, Wimsey sat at his desk sorting through his notes on the case. The evidence, though complete, now felt oddly weightless. Letters, photographs, reports, all the tangible fragments of a story that had already evaporated. He leafed through the photographs Bunter had taken, the chapel interior, the statue, the pew. In one image, almost imperceptibly, a faint reflection glimmered in the glass pane near the altar. A pale oval, blurred by motion. He studied it closely. It could have been a trick of light, or perhaps a figure passing behind the photographer. "Bunter," he called absently, "did anyone move behind you when you took this?" "No, my lord. The chapel was empty." "Quite," said Wimsey softly, staring at the print. "Empty is such a flexible term." He set it down, feeling that peculiar chill one experiences when logic falters in the face of coincidence. "No," he said aloud, almost irritably. "We agreed. No ghosts, only guilt." Still, when the clock struck midnight, he found himself lighting a candle, quite unconsciously, and watching the flame bend and recover, as though acknowledging his skepticism. The next morning brought a letter from the Archdeacon, thanking him for his invaluable assistance in restoring moral order to Liskeard. Wimsey read it over breakfast, then laughed until the marmalade trembled. "Moral order, Bunter. Imagine that, restored with a candle and a coroner's form. We should sell it in bottles." He sobered after a moment, folding the letter carefully. "Still, the Archdeacon's gratitude has a certain charm. Perhaps we should pay a final courtesy visit. I'd like to see how the convent fares without its sinners." Bunter inclined his head. "Very good, my lord. Shall I arrange the tickets?" "You shall. And pack something warm. Cornwall is never quite done with its damp." 3 days later, they arrived once more in Liskeard to find the convent gates newly painted and the town returned to its habitual calm. The sisters, it seemed, had resumed their quiet routines, though a faint air of superstition still lingered around St. Agatha's like incense after Mass. The Reverend Mother received Wimsey in her study. She was paler now, but composed. "You return, Lord Peter. I thought your curiosity had been appeased." "Curiosity," he said gently, "is an incurable ailment. I merely came to see whether peace, that most delicate of flowers, had taken root." "It has," she said. "The sisters have found their rhythm again. Even the chapel feels lighter." "And yet," said Wimsey, glancing toward the window, "one senses a draught still." She smiled faintly. "Perhaps that is grace." He bowed. "Then may it continue to blow through your walls." Afterwards, he wandered alone through the garden where winter roses struggled bravely against the cold. The air smelled of earth and renewal. He paused by the fountain, noticing that its water, once stagnant, now ran clear. "Redemption," he murmured, "is an admirable thing, Bunter, but it does tend to spoil a perfectly good mystery." "Yes, my lord," said Bunter, "though it simplifies housekeeping." Wimsey chuckled. "You have the soul of an angel and the temperament of a valet. A perfect combination." As they prepared to depart, Sister Agatha appeared at the gate. She carried a small parcel wrapped neatly in brown paper. "The Reverend Mother asked me to give you this," she said. "It was found under the floor near the confessional after the carpenters came. She thought it might belong to you." Wimsey took it, curious, and unwrapped it on the platform as their train waited. Inside was a small silver crucifix, and beneath it a folded page torn from a book of hours. The Latin inscription read, "Lux perpetua luceat eis, may perpetual light shine upon them." Beneath, in faint pencil, someone had written, "For those who burned too brightly." Wimsey stared at it for a long time before tucking it into his pocket. "Bunter," he said softly, "remind me to send a donation to the convent library." "Yes, my lord. Shall I mark it as anonymous?" "No," said Wimsey with an odd smile. "Let them know it's from the unrepentant." The train began to move, the countryside unfolding once more into mist and stone. Wimsey leaned back, his expression distant. "You know, Bunter," he said after a while, "I've been thinking about candles. Such fragile things, made to vanish, yet trusted to outlast the dark. Perhaps that's why we keep lighting them, even when we know the wax will betray us. A practical necessity, my lord, said Bunter, hardly a philosophy. Ah, but all necessities are philosophies in disguise, even faith. He fell silent then, watching the grey hills recede. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang, clear and solitary, the note carrying across the fields like a question no one quite dared to answer. Whimsy closed his eyes and murmured, half to himself, I wonder, Bunter, whether forgiveness feels anything like that sound, brief, certain, and gone before one can decide to believe it. Bunter made no reply. The rhythm of the train took over, steady and hypnotic, and for a while the world seemed to move in time with Whimsy's thoughts. He reached into his pocket and touched the folded page, feeling its fragile edges beneath his fingers. Burn too brightly, he repeated under his breath, and smiled. A small, weary smile that belonged to a man who had seen too much of light and shadow to wholly trust either. The candle flame of St. Agatha's had gone out, but somewhere within him a faint echo of its glow lingered still, steady as memory, stubborn as truth. Winter deepened in London with its usual theatrical melancholy, the streets shining under gaslight and the air filled with the hiss of tires on wet cobblestone. Lord Peter Whimsy, whose temperament always sharpened in the chill months, seemed restless again, as though the end of one mystery merely opened the door to another. He spent his days at his club, reading newspapers he barely glanced at, and his evenings playing sonatas that drifted from delight into dissonance before he abandoned them mid-bar. Bunter observed this mood with the tact of a physician watching a chronic malady. "You've been unsettled since our return from Cornwall, my lord," he remarked one morning while polishing the silver tray. "Unsettled, Bunter," Whimsy said, lighting a cigarette, "is simply my natural state. The human soul, if it has one, detests conclusion. I solved that wretched candle case too completely. It left no room for imagination." He exhaled a thin ribbon of smoke. "And imagination, my dear fellow, is the only solvent for fact." He tried to smile, but it faltered halfway. "I keep thinking of Miss Copley. Not her death, but her peace. It looked rehearsed, as though she'd been preparing for it all her life." Bunter, folding a napkin, replied with mild gravity, "Preparation is often the only control people have, my lord." Whimsy regarded him over the flame of his match. "You're beginning to sound like a confessor. Dangerous habit in a valet." "Better a confessor than an accomplice," said Bunter smoothly, and Whimsy laughed, one of those low, genuine laughs that reminded one why people forgave his excesses. But the laughter faded quickly. He turned toward the window, where the city stretched in its grey sprawl, chimneys exhaling like tired beasts. "I've been thinking of paying a visit to Mr. Guard," he said. "I can't quite rid myself of the sense that he's left something unfinished. Men of his kind rarely disappear without mischief." "Shall I make inquiries, my lord?" "Naturally," said Whimsy. "I imagine he's hiding somewhere in London. They always come to London. The city forgives sins as easily as it forgets faces." It was 3 days later when Bunter returned with information. "Guard is lodging under another name in Camden, my lord, working at a floristry shop. Goes by Mr. Harris now. Keeps to himself." "Floristry," said Whimsy with a delighted shiver. "From gardener to florist, how poetically consistent. Redemption through petals. I wonder whether he arranges lilies with the same guilty precision he arranged alibis." The next morning, Whimsy went to Camden, dressed with studied informality in a dark overcoat and scarf that made him appear almost anonymous. The shop was small but immaculate, its air heavy with damp soil and chrysanthemums. Guard, or Harris, stood behind the counter, older, thinner, and more subdued. When he saw Whimsy, his face stiffened, then softened into resignation. "You've no business here, my lord," he said. "Quite right," Whimsy replied pleasantly. "But I make a habit of bad manners when conscience permits." He examined a bouquet absently. "You've taken to flowers. How appropriate. They die beautifully." God grimaced. "I've had enough of death." "So have we all," said Whimsy. "But it does. Insist on our company. You might as well sit with it politely." They went into the small back room where the smell of earth thickened. Whimsy accepted a cup of tea with grave courtesy. "Tell me," he said, "why did you run? You'd been released, your guilt diluted by official incompetence. Why not stay?" God rubbed his hands together. "Because I couldn't stand it there. Every face in that town looked like hers. The church bells, the sound of them, it felt like she was waiting." He stared at his cup. "I didn't kill her, my lord. You know that." "I do," said Whimsy quietly. "And yet you think she haunts you." God's eyes flicked up sharply. "Don't mock me." "I never mock penitence," said Whimsy. "Only pretense. What haunts you isn't her ghost but her mercy. You took advantage of her shame, and she forgave you by dying before she could accuse. That's a heavy sort of grace." God shivered. "You talk like a priest." "Heaven forbid," said Whimsy. "I lack the salary and the certainty, but I've seen enough of sin to know when it's poorly spent." They parted without rancor. God retreating into his greenhouse, Whimsy stepping into the bleak afternoon with an odd sense of relief, as if some knot in the air had quietly loosened. That night he told Bunter, "The man's broken, but not ruined. Perhaps forgiveness, like acid, corrodes more thoroughly than hatred." "A theological notion, my lord." "Possibly," said Whimsy. "But I find theology more entertaining when it ends in paradox." As the days shortened toward Christmas, Whimsy began to feel the case recede, though it left behind a faint echo in his thoughts. A sense of moral untidiness, like dust under an otherwise polished floor. Then one morning, as he sorted through his correspondence, a small package arrived, unmarked, save for his name written in an unfamiliar hand. Inside was a candle, thick, white, and unscented. There was no note. Whimsy turned it over, examined the base, and found a faint engraving. Saint Agatha's. For a moment he simply stared. "Bunter," he called. "Our Cornish acquaintances have a curious sense of souvenir." Bunter looked at it gravely. "It might be a thank-you gift, my lord." "Or a reminder," said Whimsy. "A candle from the scene of the crime. Deliciously ambiguous. Shall we light it?" "If you wish, my lord." Whimsy struck a match. The flame caught instantly, steady and bright. "Look at that," he murmured. "Not a flicker. Faithful as guilt." He let it burn a while, then snuffed it with deliberate care. "Keep it," he said. "It's always good to have one miracle in the drawer." But that night sleep eluded him. The scent of burnt wax lingered faintly in the room, mingling with the smell of rain on the stone. He dreamed, or half-dreamed, of the chapel again, the Virgin's serene face lit by a single flame, and Miss Copley kneeling beneath whispering, words he could not hear. When he woke, the candle on his table was still unlit, yet a thin line of soot marked its tip. He stared at it for a long time, then laughed softly, shaking his head. "Imagination, Peter," he murmured to himself. "You're becoming superstitious." The following afternoon, Charles Parker came by for lunch and found Whimsy in unusually contemplative spirits. "You look as if you've been talking to ghosts," said Parker. "Not ghosts," replied Whimsy, "only their administrators." "Tell me, Charles, do you ever think we mistake conscience for haunting?" Parker frowned. "You mean people invent the supernatural to excuse their guilt?" "Or to dignify it," said Whimsy. "It's easier to say, 'She haunts me,' than 'I wronged her.'" Parker shrugged. "Maybe. But you've always liked a bit of Gothic embroidery." Whimsy grinned. "True. It gives one's sins a certain aesthetic value." When Parker left, Whimsy sat a while longer at his desk, writing a final note to the Archdeacon, a polite thank you, enclosing a small check for the convent's restoration fund. At the bottom, he added a line almost unconsciously, "In memory of those who burn alone." He sealed it, then stood watching the dusk gather against the window. The world outside was beginning to twinkle with lights, each window a small assertion of warmth against the encroaching dark. "Bunter," he said softly, "I suppose every candle is a confession. The only difference is whether we blow it out ourselves or let the wind do it for us." "Very poetic, my lord," said Bunter, handing him his coat. "Shall I fetch the car?" "No," said Whimsy, slipping on his gloves. "Let's walk. I fancy the night might have something honest to say for once." They stepped out into the streets, where the lamps shimmered on the wet pavement and London moved in its quiet, relentless rhythm. The rain had eased, leaving the air sharp and clear, and somewhere in the distance a church bell chimed the hour. Whimsy tilted his hat against the wind and smiled faintly. "Do you know, Bunter, I believe I finally understand Miss Copley. She wasn't afraid of death at all. She was afraid of being misunderstood. It's the commonest fear in the world." "And do you sympathize, my lord?" "Entirely. But then, I always did prefer the company of the misunderstood." They walked on, two shadows crossing the glittering street, the sound of their footsteps merging with the city's heartbeat, while behind them the faintest wisp of fog curled upward from the Thames, like smoke from an invisible candle burning quietly somewhere beyond the reach of reason. The last chapter of the affair began, as endings often do, with something unremarkable. A letter misdelivered by the morning post. It arrived among the usual detritus of Whimsy's correspondence. An invitation to lecture at the Oxford Union, a bill for wine, and a circular from a society promising the scientific detection of ghosts. The letter itself was small, the handwriting faintly tremulous, but unmistakably female. It was addressed simply to Lord Peter Whimsy, Piccadilly, London, which showed either remarkable faith in the postal service or in his notoriety. He opened it without much thought, expecting some tiresome request for autograph or donation, but as his eyes moved over the words, the familiar mixture of irony and detachment faded from his expression. "My lord," it began, "I write not from guilt, but from remembrance. St. Agatha's has been quiet this winter, but the silence feels weighted, as if the stones remember more than they ought. The Reverend Mother has taken ill. Before her mind wanders entirely, she has asked that I write to you. There was something hidden in the chapel wall, a confession not written for any earthly judge. She bids you come if you wish to see it before it is sealed away forever. Yours in obedience, Sister Agatha." Whimsy read it twice, then laid it on the table beside his teacup. "Bunter," he said quietly, "pack a small case. It appears the dead aren't done tidying up after us." By evening, the express had carried them back to Cornwall, through the pale hush of rain on glass and the dark blur of moorland rolling past. Whimsy sat almost motionless, staring out into the night with that distant look Bunter had come to associate with both boredom and revelation. When they reached Liskeard, the wind had turned sharp, and the familiar damp scent of the sea clung to the air like memory itself. The convent stood as before, grey, disciplined, and faintly reproachful against the sky. Sister Agatha met them at the gate with a lantern, her face half in shadow. "You came," she said softly. "She thought you might." Whimsy removed his hat. "When dying women summon me, I generally take the hint." Inside, the corridors were cold but orderly, their silence so complete that every footstep seemed like a minor transgression. The Reverend Mother lay in a narrow bed in the infirmary, her face drawn tight over its bones, her hands clasped not in piety but exhaustion. Yet her eyes, when she opened them, still held that calm, hard intelligence Whimsy remembered. "You've come back," she whispered. "Even the skeptical must sometimes return to the scene of grace," he said gently. "What is it you wished me to see?" "In the chapel wall, behind the Virgin's alcove," she murmured. A loose stone. She, Miss Copley, placed something there before she died. I discovered it the night after, but I feared scandal. So I sealed it. Now it should be yours to know. Her breath caught. Her hand moved feebly toward him. You will understand. I shall do my clumsy best, said Whimsy softly. She smiled, the faintest ghost of humor crossing her lips. The best kind of understanding is clumsy. The perfect sort kills faith. Her eyes closed again, and the moment hung in silence. Later, with the Reverend Mother sleeping under morphine's gentle tyranny, Whimsy and Sister Agatha went together into the chapel. The candlelight flickered along the carved wood and polished brass, turning the air into trembling gold. Here, the young nun whispered, pointing to the wall behind the statue. Whimsy knelt, examining the stonework with a small torch he carried. Ah, yes, a craftsman's oversight or divine design. He pried delicately at the loosened block until it gave with a sigh. Inside was a small wooden box, sealed with wax, long hardened to a dull red. He lifted it reverently and placed it upon the pew. Shall we open it? If you think it right, she said. Right, he murmured, is such a flexible word. He broke the seal. Inside were two items, a folded letter and a key suspended from a tarnished chain. The letter was addressed in a delicate hand. To whomever finds this, if truth still has a use. He unfolded it carefully. The paper crackled with age, and the words, though faded, were legible. I was not murdered. I was forgiven. The man who came that night was not my destroyer, but my deliverer. I took the ether willingly, to silence the fear. It was my own hand that held the candle. When they found me, I was already gone, not into death, but into rest. Tell no one. Some sins are only cleansed in silence. The signature below was firm, almost serene. Eleanor Copley. Whimsy read it aloud softly, his voice echoing in the dim chapel. So she wrote her own absolution, he said. And the key. Sister Agatha took it, turning it over in her palm. It fits the reliquary beneath the altar. We found it empty when the restoration began. Perhaps she meant to return something. Whimsy nodded. Or lock something away forever. He replaced the stone, sealing the hollow as she watched. Will you tell the Reverend Mother? She asked. No, he said after a pause. Let her keep her peace. The living have too little of it as it is. He looked around the chapel, the flickering light painting long shadows along the pews. You see, sister, truth isn't always a gift. Sometimes it's just an echo that refuses to die. She bowed her head. Then what will you do with her letter? Carry it, said Whimsy simply, as evidence that even the guilty can write their own reprieve. When they left the chapel, dawn was beginning to seep across the horizon, the light pale and watery but honest. The convent bells stirred the air again, not mournful this time, but measured, almost tranquil. Whimsy walked to the edge of the garden where frost clung to the last dead roses and looked out toward the sea. She died as she lived, he said quietly, in control of everything except forgiveness. Sister Agatha stood beside him, her breath a mist in the cold. Do you believe she found it? He smiled faintly. If she didn't, she invented it well enough to fool the rest of us. That may be all heaven requires. Back in London a week later, Whimsy placed the letter inside his desk, beneath the tidy layers of unfinished correspondence. Life resumed its careless rhythm, visits, dinners, lectures. But something of St. Agatha's lingered, like a scent that clings to one's clothes long after leaving a church. Occasionally, he would find himself touching his pocket, half expecting to find the key still there. We tidy away the evidence, he said to Bunter one evening, but it tidies us in return. That's the joke of the detective trade. We end up cataloguing our own sins. Bunter, who was decanting the port, said only, "A useful exercise, my lord." Whimsy raised his glass. Indeed, though I sometimes wonder whether understanding a sin excuses it or merely polishes it. That winter passed quietly. He took to writing again, though his essays grew more meditative, less inclined to solve than to ponder. His friends noticed a change, a touch of gentleness beneath the irony, an occasional silence where once there had been wit. When asked about Cornwall, he would shrug and say, "A minor ecclesiastical inconvenience, nothing worth exorcising." Yet sometimes, in quieter hours, he would light a single candle and watch it burn until the wick bent, as though listening for a voice that never quite spoke. One evening, months later, a letter arrived from Sister Agatha. The Reverend Mother had died peacefully, she wrote, leaving instructions that no replacement be appointed for a year. She said the walls must rest, the letter concluded. Whimsy folded it, stared at the fire, and murmured, "Even stone must rest. How human of her." He rose, took the small box he had brought from Cornwall, and placed it upon the mantelpiece beside his copy of Dawn. "Let it burn alone," he said, striking a match to light the candle he had kept. The flame caught easily, steady and bright, filling the room with that same faint scent of wax and absolution. He watched it for a long while, the corners of his mouth curving into a smile that was neither sad nor amused, but simply content. "There you are," he said softly, as if addressing someone unseen. "You've had your confession, my dear Miss Copley, and we, poor sinners of logic, are left with the smoke." Outside, London continued its endless murmur, omnibuses, bells, and footsteps blending into the deep hum of existence. Inside, the candle flickered once, twice, then steadied, its glow throwing long, graceful shadows across the walls. The detective, the skeptic, and the accidental confessor all sat together within him, quiet for the first time. The last trace of the nun's candle burned itself out just before midnight, leaving behind only a wisp of smoke that curled toward the ceiling, then vanished, as if taking with it the final breath of mystery. Spring came upon London with its habitual reluctance, like a hostess who has agreed to give a party but would rather not. The plane trees along Piccadilly displayed their first dusty buds, and the air, though still damp with London's unrepentant soot, carried the faintest suggestion of renewal. Lord Peter Whimsy, whose moods were as seasonal as his waistcoats, found himself curiously idle. The world seemed to have gone back to its well-behaved dullness. Newspapers offered no murders of interest, no frauds with the decency to involve Latin quotations, and no letters from dying nuns. Yet beneath his usual veneer of indolent wit, there lingered a restlessness that Bunter, with the clairvoyance of long habit, detected the way a doctor detects a fever by silence. "You're not yourself, my lord," he observed one morning while setting out the breakfast tray. "I was never particularly myself, Bunter," Whimsy replied, stirring his coffee absently. "It's a notoriously ill-defined position." He rose, walked to the window, and stood there for a while, gazing at the soft haze of light over the rooftops. "I thought peace would be a more interesting pastime than it is," he murmured. "One tires of calm rather faster than of chaos." Bunter offered no opinion. He merely adjusted the morning paper so that the advertisement for a new motor car faced upward, a subtle invitation to distraction. It might have worked, had fate not intervened in its own quiet fashion. A small parcel arrived by post that afternoon, wrapped in plain brown paper. Whimsy, half expecting another book from his publisher, unwrapped it casually. Inside was a slender journal bound in worn leather, its pages edged with age and something darker. Smoke, perhaps, or time. There was no letter, only a name inscribed on the first page, Eleanor Copley. For a moment, the world seemed to contract to a point of silence. He seated himself slowly, opened the book, and began to read. The handwriting was delicate but deliberate, each entry dated in the months leading up to her death. I have prayed until my prayers taste of dust, one line began. I wish sometimes that faith required less obedience and more courage. Another, written later. I have forgiven my brother. I only wish I could forgive the world for letting him die believing I hadn't. There were pages of such thoughts, sharp, unsentimental, written with the precision of a woman who preferred truth to consolation. The final entry stopped him. If he reads this, tell him it was never about guilt. It was about understanding. I wished only that someone might look at the ashes and say, yes, they burned bright. Whimsy closed the journal and leaned back, his expression unreadable. Well, Bunter, he said after a long pause, our nun's candle continues to burn, even in absentia. Bunter, who had been waiting with quiet propriety, asked, May I inquire who sent it, my lord? No one signed it, but I suspect Sister Agatha, our ghost of conscience, has learned the postal system. She's tidying the last fragments. He rose, pacing the room. Curious, isn't it, how the dead insist on the final word? It's as though they can't bear to leave us to our own interpretations. He stopped before the window again, and perhaps they're right. We make such a mess of meaning. He was silent for a moment, then turned abruptly. I shall return it. To Cornwall, my lord. Yes, St. Agatha's deserves to keep its relics. I've had enough of moral archaeology. The journey was longer this time, or perhaps it merely felt so. The train wound through fields just beginning to green, the sky stretched wide and indifferent above. Whimsy sat with the journal on his lap, reading certain lines aloud under his breath, as though testing their sound against the rhythm of the wheels. When he reached Liskeard, the town seemed smaller, emptied of the peculiar tension it had worn before. At the convent gate, he was met by a young novice, one too new to know his face, which suited him. I've come to return this, he said, handing her the journal. It belongs in your keeping. She accepted it reverently, then hesitated. Are you Lord Peter Whimsy? Occasionally, he said with a faint smile. It depends who's asking. Then there's something else, she said, producing a folded sheet from within her sleeve. It was found among the Reverend Mother's effects after her death. She said it was meant for you. He unfolded the paper and read, You are right about truth, Lord Peter. It is not peace we seek, but proportion. Tell her story kindly. For a long time he stood there in the garden, the letter fluttering slightly in the wind. Proportion, he repeated softly. Yes, that elusive balance between mercy and justice, faith and folly. He looked toward the chapel spire, where the repaired clock now ticked with exemplary precision. At least the machinery keeps time, even when the rest of us don't. Inside the chapel, the air was cool, touched with that faint sweetness particular to old stone and long silence. He knelt for a moment beside the pew where Miss Copley had died, not in prayer exactly, but in the thoughtful stillness of a man acknowledging an equal. You wanted to be understood, he said quietly. Consider it done. You've been read, at least. He reached into his pocket and placed upon the pew a small silver matchbox engraved with his initials, a gesture that was a half-offering, half-farewell. One flame for another, he murmured, then straightened and left without looking back. When he returned to London, the days were already stretching longer, the air restless with spring's unease. He resumed his lectures, attended a concert, dined with friends who complained amiably that he was quieter than usual. Not quieter, he corrected once, smiling, simply tuned to a lower key. Yet there was a clarity about him now, a lightness that even Bunter remarked upon. You seem easier, my lord, he said one evening as Whimsy sat reading by the fire. Easier, said Whimsy, considering the word. Perhaps. Understanding does that, I suppose. It doesn't cure the ache, but it makes one grateful for it. He closed the book. You know, Bunter, I've come to think of that case not as a tragedy, but as a kind of prayer, the sort of prayer no one expects to be answered, yet somehow is. He rose, walked to the window, and watched the lamplighter making his patient rounds. "Look at that," he said softly. "Even in this city of smoke and skepticism, someone still bothers to light the darkness by hand. That's civilization, Bunter. Not progress, not reason, but that absurd insistence on flame." He smiled faintly, as if at some private joke, then turned back to the room, which glowed in the gentle amber of the fire. Outside, rain began again, soft and persistent, washing the streets clean of memory. Whimsy sat once more, stretching his long legs toward the hearth. "Bunter," he said after a pause, "I believe I've finally learned the point of candles." "Yes, my lord." "They're not for the dead at all," he said. "They're for those who remain, to remind us how light behaves when it has nowhere left to go." He leaned back, closed his eyes, and let the rhythm of the rain take him. Somewhere, in the quiet recess of his mind, a woman's voice seemed to whisper, calm, untroubled, almost amused. To be understood is enough. Whimsy smiled, not opening his eyes. "Yes," he murmured, "quite enough." The fire crackled softly, the clock chimed 11, and the smoke from the hearth curled upward in a single graceful thread, vanishing into the still air. Outside, London glimmered under its patient rain, every lamp a small confession of defiance, every flicker a promise that the darkness, however complete, was never final. The following morning, London greeted Lord Peter Wimsey with a muted brilliance, the kind of soft sunlight that makes chimneys and railings seem gilded even when covered in soot. He rose early, taking a moment to watch the city stretch and yawn from his tall window, the rooftops forming a jagged horizon against the pale blue. Bunter moved quietly about the room, tidying letters and teacups, preserving the illusion of order in the household. Whimsy, however, was preoccupied, thinking of Cornwall and the nun's candle, and the way the case had lingered in his mind longer than any ordinary crime. He dressed deliberately, choosing a coat that suggested authority without ostentation, a scarf draped to mask the casual precision of his attire, and finally, a hat tilted at that familiar, rakish angle. "Bunter," he said softly, "we may leave the comforts of domestic calm for a few hours. There is yet work to be done." Bunter inclined his head, a silent acknowledgment that some mysteries are best untangled with patience rather than haste. Their destination was a modest row of houses near Kensington, where a letter had instructed them to meet a certain solicitor, the same man who had managed Miss Copley's estate in London. The solicitor, a thin, nervous man with spectacles that slipped perpetually down his nose, greeted them with a mixture of relief and apprehension. "Lord Peter Wimsey," he said, bowing low, "I feared you would not understand the delicacy of my position." "On the contrary," said Wimsey, "delicacy is precisely why I'm here. Your office has handled many private affairs, and yet I sense this one carries an exceptional weight." The solicitor led them into a small study lined with leather-bound books and smelling faintly of cedar polish. On the desk lay documents, neat but stiff with the authority of bureaucracy. "Miss Copley's final instructions," he said, "were not meant for public consumption. They concern matters of conscience, property, and the arrangement of certain affairs after her death. I trust you will treat them accordingly." Wimsey inclined his head. "Naturally. The law is less concerned with virtue than with fact, but we shall endeavor to satisfy both as far as possible." The documents revealed a series of bequests, letters, and instructions, most of which had been partially implemented, yet several contained delicate reference to individuals unknown outside the family circle. One page, in particular, drew Wimsey's attention, a note regarding a small property in Cornwall, purchased in secrecy, to be preserved in trust for a charitable purpose of Miss Copley's choosing. The phrasing was meticulous, almost obsessive, emphasizing discretion, anonymity, and the avoidance of scandal. "Curious," said Whimsy, tilting his head. "Even in death she choreographs propriety with an almost terrifying precision. Bunter, observe the language, must be preserved inviolate, as if untouched by human greed. She treats her legacy as though sin were a material substance." Bunter nodded, making notes silently. "And this," Whimsy continued, "correlates precisely with her behavior in Cornwall. The candles, the ether, the careful staging of her passing, it was not merely ritual, it was strategy." After leaving the solicitor, Whimsy insisted upon walking through the streets, the city alive with its morning routines, vendors hawking newspapers, cabbies shouting their fares. He paused at a small square where children played among the puddles left by last night's rain. "Observe, Bunter," he said quietly, "how life insists on triviality even in the presence of moral gravity. The world continues its business, utterly indifferent to the fact that some of its citizens burn their candles alone, for reasons only they understand." They moved on, and Whimsy's gaze lingered on the horizon where the Thames shimmered faintly in the sunlight. "That is the lesson, I think," he murmured. "The living must carry on, not the dead. And yet the dead influence the living, more than we dare admit." Back at the flat, Whimsy took out the small silver crucifix and key that had come from St. Agatha's. He turned them over in his hands, observing the faint patina of age, the subtle weight that suggested both permanence and fragility. "Even the smallest objects," he said, "can contain worlds. A key, a crucifix, a fragment of wax. Each can direct behavior, memory, and conscience. Bunter, the detective's work is seldom about the act alone. It is about the resonance it leaves behind." Bunter looked at him gravely. "So we keep them, my lord?" "Yes," said Whimsy. "They are reminders that understanding, like virtue, is rarely obvious. Sometimes it is hidden in a small, careful gesture, and recognized only by those willing to observe." In the days that followed, he returned to his usual routines, attending lectures, meeting friends, and performing the minor social rituals expected of his rank. Yet the nun's candle persisted in his thoughts, not as a mystery in the traditional sense, but as a meditation on human behavior, morality, and the subtle mechanisms of atonement. One evening, he received a note from Sister Agatha. It thanked him for ensuring the safe return of the journal and expressed the convent's continued gratitude for his discretion. "It appears," he remarked to Bunter, "that silence can be the most profound form of justice. The living, guided by memory and conscience, need no intervention from the law." Later that night, he lit a single candle in his study, placing it beside the journal and the crucifix. Its flame was steady, unyielding and delicate, casting long, subtle shadows against the walls. He watched it, imagining Miss Copley kneeling once more in her chapel, the wax dripping in careful cadence, the air heavy with both incense and intent. "Bunter," he said softly, "do you think she knew how bright she burned?" Bunter, polishing a brass lamp with meticulous attention, replied simply, "I should think she did, my lord." Whimsy smiled faintly, letting the words settle into the quiet of the room. As midnight approached, he penned a final note to himself, a reflection on the case and the lessons it had imparted. He wrote carefully, almost ceremoniously, "Even the most meticulous of candles must eventually burn down. The measure of one's life is not how long the flame lasts, but how brightly it burns in the memory of others." He closed the notebook, tucked the key and crucifix beside it, and leaned back in his chair, the fire casting a soft glow across his features. Outside, London murmured in its habitual, indifferent cadence. Omnibuses rattling, footsteps echoing, and the occasional distant bell ringing a note that seemed almost like a question. Whimsy smiled faintly, taking a long, satisfied breath. Bunter moved to the window, drawing the curtains against the early dawn. "Shall I prepare for the day, my lord?" "Yes, Bunter," Whimsy replied. "But let, Us keep this moment for ourselves a little longer. There is merit in letting the candle burn out on its own, without our interference." The flame flickered once, then steadied again, small and unwavering. Whimsy sat in quiet contemplation, letting the shadows and the light mingle, knowing that the resolution of one mystery need not silence the mind, but merely prepare it for another. Somewhere, faintly, the memory of St. Agatha's whispered through his thoughts, and for the first time since the events in Cornwall, he felt a profound, serene closure. As the morning light touched the city, he rose and stretched, moving with the languid precision of a man at peace. He gathered the journal, the key and the crucifix, and placed them carefully in a drawer. "There," he said softly. "All in order. The dead have spoken. The living may now continue." Bunter inclined his head. "Shall I fetch your hat, my lord?" "Yes," said Whimsy, "and we shall step into the world again, unburdened by yesterday, yet enriched by its lessons." The city hummed beyond the window, ordinary and unremarkable, and Lord Peter Whimsy, detective, philosopher, and observer of human folly, prepared to meet it once more, carrying the quiet triumph of understanding, the faint scent of wax lingering like a secret in the air. The weeks that followed passed with the deliberate, indifferent rhythm of a city that cares little for the concerns of men, and Lord Peter Whimsy found himself again ensconced in his Piccadilly flat, the curtains drawn to catch the weak light of early spring, and the fire crackling softly in the grate. Bunter moved quietly about the room, arranging correspondence, adjusting the silver, and maintaining the small order that made chaos tolerable. Whimsy sat near the window, one knee draped over the arm of his chair, reading and rereading the small journal of Miss Eleanor Copley. The words, so precise and deliberate, seemed almost to speak again in the flicker of the lamplight, and he found himself thinking not of the crime or its solution, but of the meticulous human care behind each act, the candles chosen with deliberate wax, the letters folded with the faintest touch of memory, the key hidden and recovered. He lit a small candle beside him and watched it, steady, unyielding, a private echo of that singular flame which had first drawn him to Cornwall. "Bunter," he said softly, "some people live their lives as though arranging candles, every action measured, every moment considered, every mistake anticipated and corrected." Bunter, polishing the brass inkstand, inclined his head. "A rare skill, my lord, but exhausting for others." Whimsy smiled faintly, acknowledging the truth in that observation. Late that afternoon, a knock at the door heralded the arrival of Charles Parker, who carried with him the habitual mixture of officiousness and polite curiosity that had accompanied him through so many of Whimsy's cases. "Good afternoon, Lord Peter," he said. "I trust Cornwall has treated you kindly." "It has," Whimsy replied, setting aside the journal, and left behind more questions than answers, as is its custom. Parker, seated with careful precision, leaned forward. "Questions? I thought all had been resolved. Guards been dealt with, the Reverend Mother's account recorded, the estate settled." Whimsy chuckled softly, the sound low and almost wistful. "Ah, but resolution is merely a term to comfort the impatient. The question is never the act itself, but the echoes it leaves behind, the shape it carves into memory." Parker raised an eyebrow. "And what shape did Miss Copley carve into yours?" Whimsy lit his cigarette slowly, inhaling the smoke before replying. "One of meticulous care, intelligence, and courage. She arranged her departure as if it were a lesson. That lesson is not about guilt or retribution. It is about understanding and the responsibility we bear for comprehending the actions of others." That evening, after Parker had left and Bunter had served supper, Whimsy returned to the journal, reading passages that reflected a life of measured thought and quiet bravery. One entry in particular caught his eye. I have sought to reconcile the world to my conscience, though I know it will rarely recognize the effort. Still, I light my candle and trust the flame to bear witness." Whimsy repeated the words aloud, letting them roll in the quiet room like the faint toll of a distant bell. "Yes, Bunter," he murmured, "even the smallest flame can illuminate more than we imagine." He set the journal aside, turning to a small key and crucifix that had traveled with him from Cornwall, placing them gently on the mantel. Each object carried weight beyond its mere size, memory, responsibility, and the unspoken testament of a life lived with deliberation. The candle beside him flickered gently in acknowledgement, its small flame steady in the still air. Days passed, marked by the ordinary patterns of London life, lectures, social calls, and minor business engagements. Yet beneath the familiar rhythms, whimsy carried the subtle resonance of Cornwall and the nun's candle. He found himself observing details others would overlook, a misplaced letter, a pattern in a shadow, the way light fell across a polished table, and reflecting on how each small act could carry consequences beyond immediate perception. One afternoon, he received a brief note from Sister Agatha, conveyed with all the formality of the convent, yet imbued with warmth. It acknowledged his care in returning the journal and the silver crucifix, expressing gratitude not merely for the objects themselves, but for the respect and understanding he had shown. Whimsy read it aloud, his voice low and deliberate. "It is, Bunter, one of the rare virtues of humanity to recognize value where it may otherwise be lost. We are often judged by our attention, not our actions." Bunter, arranging the tea service, nodded silently, the unspoken agreement of men who understand observation as its own reward. One evening, as the light faded and the city's gas lamps ignited in their regular, quiet protest against darkness, Whimsy returned to the journal once more, tracing the handwriting with his finger. He read aloud a passage that spoke of forgiveness. "I have given what I could, and asked for nothing in return. In the quiet of the chapel, I have sought the balance between duty and mercy." He paused, letting the words resonate. "The measure of a life is seldom its deeds alone," he said softly. "It is the consistency with which one navigates the narrow paths between error and understanding." He leaned back, watching the candle's reflection in the glass, thinking of Miss Copley kneeling in her chapel, the single flame flickering yet unwavering. The following week brought a minor social engagement at which Whimsy was expected to lecture on the Restoration poets, a subject he approached with both genuine interest and his characteristic dry humor. As he spoke, he noticed the careful way his audience leaned forward at each measured point, responding to rhythm and cadence as though the structure of language itself could confer moral understanding. He allowed himself a faint smile. Even in poetry, he thought, we seek the same order we admired in Miss Copley's careful arrangements. The disciplined hand, the unerring attention to detail, the quiet insistence that meaning be preserved. When the lecture concluded, he walked through the evening streets with Bunter at his side, the gas lamps casting long shadows over the wet pavement. "We are fortunate," he murmured, "that life allows us such small triumphs. Clarity, understanding, the satisfaction of seeing intention survive circumstance." Returning home, he found the journal resting on his desk, as though waiting for him. He opened it one final time, noting the careful way Miss Copley had recorded her thoughts and actions. "Bunter," he said softly, "we spend our lives searching for logic, for explanation, for the resolution of uncertainty. And yet sometimes the greatest clarity is found not in solving, but in witnessing. She witnessed herself, and in doing so, she granted us the same gift." Bunter adjusted the blind silently, letting the city's light filter into the room. "A rare grace, my lord." "Indeed," said Whimsy, "rare and entirely human." He lit a single candle on the mantel and watched it burn, steady and quiet, a reflection of order and reflection, patience and understanding. Outside, the streets murmured in their habitual, indifferent rhythm, and for a time he allowed himself the luxury of stillness. The nun's candle had ended, yet its echo lingered in his mind. The lesson of meticulous care, of courage in small gestures, and of understanding that transcends even death. He leaned back in his chair, hands clasped behind his head, and allowed the flame to occupy his thoughts entirely. Somewhere beyond the walls, London moved on, indifferent yet alive, and whimsy, detective, observer, and occasional philosopher, watched it with quiet satisfaction, knowing that the candle, like memory, had burned perfectly, leaving only warmth behind.